You're crouched by a fire deep in a cave system, watching smoke curl up toward a blackened ceiling. Somebody just tossed a handful of dried leaves onto the coals, not for food, not by accident. They lean in, they breathe it in, on purpose. This is not a modern habit picked up outside an office building. This is tens of thousands of years old. Here's the thing nobody tells you. Humans didn't start smoking for pleasure. They started smoking to talk to something they couldn't see. This is the story of how burning a plant and inhaling its smoke became one of the oldest, most widespread human behaviors on Earth, and why the version we know today, the cigarette, the addiction, the industry, might be the biggest betrayal of what smoking was actually built for. Let's go back further than you think. Not to Egypt, not to the Mayans burning ceremonial bundles. Further. In 2021, archaeologists working a rock shelter in Utah's Great Salt Lake Desert found something strange. 4 charred wild tobacco seeds sitting inside a hearth, dated to roughly 12,300 years old. That's not a typo. 12,300 years. That predates farming, predates the wheel, predates almost every ancient thing you've ever been taught to think of as ancient. Here's where it gets interesting. The seeds weren't found with pipes. No bowls, no tubes, no smoking apparatus of any kind. Just seeds, in a fire, next to duck bones from a meal. So what were they doing? The leading theory is that early humans weren't smoking tobacco the way you're picturing it. They were likely chewing it, or wadding it with ash and holding it in the cheek, a practice still used by some indigenous communities today, functionally similar to how people use chewing tobacco or nicotine pouches now. But, and this matters, tobacco doesn't grow itself into your hearth by accident. Wild tobacco is bitter, it's harsh. It is not a plant your body is naturally begging you to put in your mouth. Someone had to try it first. Someone had to endure the burn, the bitterness, the nausea, and come back for more. And whatever they got out of that experience, it was worth repeating enough times that it became a habit passed down for over 12 millennia. Here's the nicotine problem. Nicotine is a natural insecticide. Plants don't produce it to be friendly. They produce it to poison the animals trying to eat them. Which means the earliest tobacco users in the Great Basin weren't discovering a treat. They were hijacking a plant's chemical defense system and turning it into something that altered their mind, their alertness, their mood. Whether that was medicinal, ritual, or simply the oldest form of catching a buzz around a fire, we don't know for sure. And we may never know. What we do know is this. By the time you get to written history, smoking wasn't new. It was already ancient. Which raises the real question this video is actually about. Not did ancient humans smoke, but how many separate times, in how many separate corners of the planet, did humans independently arrive at the exact same idea? Burn a plant, breathe it in, feel something shift. Independent origins across continents. Here's the part that should genuinely mess with your head. The Great Basin tobacco users in North America almost certainly had zero contact with what was happening on the other side of the planet, in Africa, where people were burning entirely different plants for entirely different reasons, and yet arriving at a nearly identical ritual. In parts of southern Africa, archaeologists have found pipe fragments and burnt plant residue in rock shelters dating back thousands of years, tied to cannabis and wild datura use long before any recorded contact between continents. Different plant, different chemistry, same core idea: fire, smoke, inhale, transform. Meanwhile, in the highlands of what's now Ethiopia, some researchers point to charred plant material in hearths that may represent early psychoactive plant burning tied to shamanic or healing practice, though dating and interpretation here remain genuinely contested among archaeologists, and honestly, some of it may never be fully resolved. And over in Mesoamerica, separated from both Africa and North America by oceans, The ancient Maya weren't just smoking, they were worshipping it. Ceramic vessels from as early as the 1st century BCE depict figures smoking rolled tobacco leaves, and the Maya word for smoking, sikar, is where we eventually get the word cigar. For the Maya, tobacco wasn't recreational, it was a direct line to the gods, used by priests and shamans to enter trance states, to communicate with ancestors, to heal the sick. Here's the thing nobody tells you about ancient smoking. Almost nowhere on Earth did it start as a casual habit. It started as medicine. It started as ceremony. It started as a technology for altering consciousness on purpose in a controlled, sacred context, not something you did alone, bored, refreshing an inbox at 2 p.m. Of course, they wrapped it in ritual. If you found a plant that could shift your entire mental state with nothing but fire and breath, wouldn't you build a story around it too? Wouldn't you decide it was a gift, not just a habit? 3 continents, 3 unrelated plants, 3 separate populations of humans with no way of contacting each other, and all 3 landed on the same basic ritual. Burn it, breathe it, let it change you. So here's the real evidence problem archaeologists face. Is this convergent invention, humans independently stumbling onto the same idea because the human brain simply responds to smoke-delivered alkaloids in a specific, replicable way? Or is there something deeper going on? Some shared ancient root behavior stretching back even further than any of these individual finds? Nobody has a clean answer. But the next piece of evidence might push the timeline back further than almost anyone expected. The Neanderthal question. Here's where the story stops being about Homo sapiens entirely. Because there's a hypothesis floating around serious academic circles that doesn't just push the timeline back a few thousand years, it pushes it back past our own species. At sites like Tabun Cave in Israel, archaeologists have found soot layers and burnt plant residues associated with Neanderthal hearths, some dating back tens of thousands of years before modern humans arrived in the region. Neanderthals were unquestionably using fire deliberately, controlling it, maintaining it, building their lives around it. Here's the wild part. Researcher Gary Fitzgerald and several ethnobotanists have pointed out that many wild plants growing in Neanderthal territory, species related to wild rue, certain resins, and aromatic shrubs, produce psychoactive or medicinal smoke when burned. Nothing proves Neanderthals were deliberately inhaling these fumes for effect, rather than warmth or cooking, but the possibility sits right there in the evidence, unresolved. Think about that for a second. If Neanderthals were burning psychoactive plants near their hearths, even accidentally, even just breathing in resin smoke while huddled together against the cold, that means the human relationship with inhaled plant smoke might not have started with humans at all. It might have started with a cousin species, in a cave, tens of thousands of years before anyone alive today's ancestors ever existed. We don't know for sure. We may never know. The evidence is thin, contested, and easy to overread, but it's taken seriously enough by real researchers that it can't just be dismissed as science fiction. Here's the smoke inhalation problem, though, and it's a real one. Breathing in smoke, any smoke, damages lungs. Ancient hearths in enclosed caves have been linked by paleopathologists to skeletal signs of respiratory stress in prehistoric remains. Which means whatever ancient humans, and possibly Neanderthals, were getting out of smoke, ritual, warmth, altered consciousness, connection, they were paying for it, physically, from the very beginning. And that's the tension this whole video keeps circling back to. Smoke was never neutral. Even in its earliest, most sacred form, it was already trading something the body needed for something the mind wanted. Which brings us to the moment this story shifts, because everything up to this point, the seeds in Utah, the pipes in Africa, the ceramics in Mesoamerica, the maybe Neanderthals in Tabun Cave, all of it was ritual, controlled, sacred, rare. What happened next is where the story stops being beautiful. Fast forward past the Maya priests, past the native ceremonies, past every culture that treated smoke as something sacred and rare, and you land in the 1880s, in a factory, watching the Bonsack cigarette rolling machine spit out cigarettes at a rate no human hand could ever match. Roughly 200 per minute, then thousands, then millions a day. Here's the uncomfortable part. Everything that made ancient tobacco use meaningful, the ceremony, the scarcity, the deliberate intention, the fact that it was reserved for priests, healers, sacred moments, every single one of those guardrails got stripped away in less than a century. What was once a plant you approached with caution, ritual, and respect became a product engineered, quite literally with added chemicals and refined nicotine delivery systems, to be consumed as often and as unconsciously as possible. Not to connect you to ancestors, not to heal, to keep you buying. Of course they industrialized it. Of course a plant humans had spent 12,000 years treating as powerful eventually got treated as a commodity. That's what happens to almost everything sacred once enough money touches it. History is sometimes beautiful in the most absurd and sometimes ugly ways. By the mid-20th century, tobacco use had gone from an occasional ceremonial act performed by a handful of people in a community to a daily habit for roughly half of American adults. And the health consequences that ancient users occasionally glimpsed through burnt lungs and hearth smoke became a public health catastrophe playing out on a scale no shaman or priest in Utah or the Yucatan could have possibly imagined. Here's the gap nobody talks about. The earliest smokers used fire and breath to reach towards something bigger than themselves. The modern industry used the exact same biological mechanism to reach into people's pockets. Same plant, same smoke, completely different purpose. So what do we actually know at the end of all this? We know tobacco use in the Americas goes back at least 12,300 years. We know multiple, unconnected human populations across different continents independently discovered the same basic act: burn a plant, inhale, let it change you. We know it started as medicine and ceremony almost everywhere it appears. And we have real, serious, if unproven evidence suggesting the behavior might trace back even further than our own species. What we don't know, and may never know, is what the very first person to try it was thinking, what they were hoping to feel, whether it worked. Go back to that cave, the fire, the dried leaves hitting the coals, somebody leaning in, breathing deep, on purpose, for the first time in human history. They weren't chasing a habit, they were reaching for something they didn't have a word for yet. 12,000 years later, we're still breathing it in. We just forgot to ask why.